Hello there. Um, Welcome to another episode of Citizen X. This one is called Women, Feminism and the Surveillance State. Since I began this project, I have often been dismayed by the amount of people who shrug their shoulders and accept the so-called inevitability that privacy is already gone. These people, who it seems account for the vast majority of the population, appear to have abdicated all the decisions about the shape of their society to someone else. And usually that someone else is the power-hungry and surveillance-obsessed state. So far, so typical. However, I've also been shocked by the amount of people who appear to actively endorse the amount of surveillance that we are subject to and are enthusiastic for more. What is so shocking is that so many of these people are women. So why is this? Well, the reasons I think are fairly straightforward if we look clearly, but they are, as usual, mistaken. We are now well into the so-called third wave of feminism. Feminism, as we understand it, has now been around for a century, and it has made enormous strides in that time. Starting as a perfectly reasonable aspiration to have women's voices heard by demanding that they be allowed to vote. By the 60s came the second wave, with such intellectual giants as Germaine Greer, Andrea Dworkin and Gloria Steinem moved the discussion into advancing the social and cultural aspirations that women had. It was during the second wave that what many might call extreme feminism resulted in publications like Valerie Solanas' Scum, which is the Society for Cutting Up Men, and known as the Scum Manifesto. As I say, Scum was considered extreme even by the radical standards of the 60s. However, it found an audience, and its central theme seems to be that men have ruined the world and it is up to women to fix it by eliminating men. So Scum and attitudes like it have simmered and festered over the decades, seemingly waiting for technology to catch up with its goals. Biologically speaking, great progress, if you can call it that, has been made in the field of mostly female fertility. So much so that procreation can now take place with only the tiniest contribution from men. Added to that, a woman now has a guaranteed surrogate father in the shape of the modern welfare state to enable her to raise a child with almost no input from the biological father. Now, this is not a critique of socialism, of which there is much to commend, but not too much. No, my concern is surveillance, and I want to keep it narrow, because although there are many ways in which to make someone effectively unfree, it is surveillance that is the most direct threat to liberty and to free societies. Surveillance renders all other freedoms useless. So the central tenet of the Scum Manifesto and other like-minded feminist thought is that men are, quite literally, unstable. Men, in having an X and a Y chromosome, are incomplete compared to women who have two balancing X chromosomes. So this deficiency, goes the thinking, makes men emotionally limited, egocentric, lacking in empathy, and most of all, violently unstable. So bringing this back to surveillance, in a perfect world where only those who were suspected of criminality would be watched, since men are inherently violent and unstable, it must be men who must be watched. The pure fact of a man being male is the probable cause. That is the justification. Because women seldom do anything illegal, or at least anything violent, it is not women who need to be watched. So surveillance feeds into the conscious and the unconscious fear that women have of men. Men are violent. Women are the victims of violence. So men need to be put under surveillance. Result: women feel safer. Marvellous. Except it isn't. Not for men, certainly, but also not for women, and certainly not for our society. For one thing, what surveillance does is a con trick. It makes lily-livered people, and especially women, feel safe. It doesn't make them safe, it just makes them feel so. The most likely victims of violence in our society, by an enormous margin, are not women. They are young men. Look at the statistics. Surveillance makes women feel safe. But should we formulate policy by what is best, or by what feels best? And this sort of thinking is creeping everywhere. Women-only carriages on trains and trams are becoming a reality. So I am to be denied a ride on public transport because I'm a man. That doesn't sound very fair to me. It sounds, dare I say, a touch discriminatory. So women are not at risk. Well, they are, just as everyone is. But they are not the actual victims that many people, women and feminists, believe them to be. In fact, women are protected to a much greater degree than is ever acknowledged. Without wanting to overegg the pudding here, there is a natural chivalry that is hardwired into the overwhelming number of men. Sure, there are exceptions, and we will hear about every single one of those that is reported, but most men regard men who visit violence upon women as beyond contempt. The third wave construct of rape culture is a myth, at least in the West. So this belief, fostered by strident and self-serving feminists, that men are unstable and violent marauding beasts that cannot be trusted even for a moment to be allowed to run free in society, leads neatly into an idea that if men can be kept on an invisible leash, then, and only then, will women be free. In this context, surveillance is a very effective idea amongst feminists of being able to control men, and very seductive to women in general. In a twisted, upside down, inside out and fucked up way, for many women, surveillance symbolises freedom. Karen Strawn, a Canadian commentator, has poured scorn on this pernicious idea by restating the obvious notion that men are not, and never have been, the enemies of women. However, in the surveillance state, driven by women's irrational fears, women may well become the enemies of men. What follows is a number of examples of how surveillance endangers rather than safeguards women. These are not examples off the top of my head, but ones that I've thought about. And I've had to think about them, because as with every other argument encountering the idea of ever-increasing surveillance being a good thing, these examples are far from obvious. However, that does not make them any less valid. Example 1. A woman, perhaps with children, perhaps without, is in a domestic situation with a dominating and physically stronger violent partner. Probably a man, although it could also be a lesbian relationship. After one too many beatings, she decides to flee. She takes refuge in a woman's shelter for battered wives. I've never heard of one for battered husbands, although they are far from an unusual group. Nevertheless, the shelter takes her in, or arranges some secure accommodation. Now, the location of the accommodation is kept secret for obvious reasons. However, unbeknownst to her, her partner has a friend who works watching the local CCTV monitors. The friend, who doesn't see himself as being corrupt in any way, but just someone who wants to help his friend find the wife that he desperately loves, and he passes on the information to the husband. The violent partner now has access to her whereabouts and can strike at will. The same scenario is also possible if someone were to be able to get access to the shelter's records. The records may be supposedly secure, but some years ago the British government, who you might think, with all the resources at their disposal, might know a thing or two about encryption, compromised the medical records of 26 million people. That's almost the in almost half the entire population. Imagine the level of encryption and computer savviness available to an underfunded local women's refuge. The woman and her children are located and then murdered by the husband. He is not brought to trial because he commits suicide shortly afterwards. The above scenario might also be repeated, and probably more effectively, if the husband was able to access automatic number plate recognition records, which is, of course, real-time data. Example 2. A young Asian woman of Muslim parentage refuses the suitor arranged for her marriage. Knowing the seriousness of this, she leaves home and goes into hiding. The parents are devout Muslims, and the shame that this brings upon the family is intolerable. The family live in a predominantly Muslim area with a sizable, even a dominant representation on the local council. The father talks to the local imam, who talks to the Muslim leader in the council, knowing that they will come across a sympathetic ear. Requests are made, CCTV, ANPR and other records are accessed, and the young woman's whereabouts is discovered and the information divulged to younger male members of the extended family. The woman has acid thrown in her face. The perpetrators are caught and convicted, but the young woman is blinded and scarred for life. Example 3. A woman enters local politics. She is protesting the building of a bypass through her village. Her campaigning is effective and she starts to make a difference. The tide is turning against the building of the bypass. The bypass is vital to strategic governmental transport policy and also has some extremely juicy contracts up for grabs. A contractor has been promised a big slice of the pie on the assumption that the scheme will go through. The contractor has maybe leveraged himself up to the hilt in order to get the contract, and it would be a disaster if it was cancelled. The governmental team and the contractor agreed that the scheme must go ahead. Investigations are made into the woman's past, and the previously compromised medical records, see above, of the woman's abortion performed 20 years earlier come to light. The woman is now happily married with children, and her family have no knowledge of this period in her life. Discreetly, the woman is made aware that this information may become public. However, if she were to withdraw her objections to the bypass, it could be guaranteed that this information will never see the light of day. The bypass goes ahead. As is obvious in these cases, the surveillance culture has worked against the women in these scenarios. You'll notice that in the first two examples the perpetrators were discovered, and in the case of the young Asian woman, punished. Indeed, it may have been the apparatus of surveillance that helped, but the point is the damage had already been done. With deranged people, like the fanatical Muslims, and the desperate people like the estranged husband, they don't care what happens to them. Their only care is the harm that they can do. Another thing about these hypothetical examples is that they feature women who are good, or at least morally neutral women. Just imagine the purchase that those in power might have over women who are much more morally compromised. Women who've had affairs, women who might have had a lot of casual sex when they were younger, well, you know, like men try to when they are young. Women who have had multiple abortions, women who might at one stage, possibly because of financial necessity, have worked as strippers or in the sex trade, women who might have had periods of drink or alcohol abuse, women who've had mental health issues. In short, any women who might, at some stage in their lives and for whatever reasons, have done anything of which they may now would rather not have known to all and sundry. That's not secrecy, that's privacy, and there's a difference. But even if the examples above never happen, and all information is properly secure, which none is, and no surveillance protocols are ever undermined for nefarious reasons, which they will be, the surveillance society will always logically, in a long enough timeline, end up as fascism, with too few people in power having information about, and therefore power over, the rest of us, too readily to hand. The temptation to use it for one's own ends will, in the end, be irresistible. But then, of course, fools that they are, that is what some people want. In the never-ending merry-go-round of "I'm the biggest victim", feminists will always paint women as the longest suffering victims of all. And this suits their purpose. By labelling women as victims, and by extension labelling men as oppressors, this nicely sets up the conditions for the acceptable surveillance of men. But then there is also something very interesting going on here, and I think that it's mostly unconscious. If we go back hundreds of thousands of years and all the way up until quite recently, the natural state of a man was mobile. A man would hunt. He would leave the village, either alone or with other men, every day to hunt. Quite literally, to bring home the bacon. That was what a man did. He roamed, he hunted, and so long as he wasn't killed by lions, he returned. The women, meanwhile, stayed home. They stayed in the village, with all the other women. If they did leave, they foraged but stayed much closer to the village, since they were not tracking mobile and possibly fast-moving prey. The fact that a man was out of the sight of the women for long periods of time was an unavoidable fact of life, but one which afforded a man a quite significant degree of autonomy. An autonomy that a woman, particularly if she was a mother, simply did not have, tied as she was to her children, her home in the village, and visible to the ever-prying eyes of her fellow villagers. So even then, a man was able to exercise a lot more independence, we could call it freedom, than the typical woman. Although this independence was, as I say, unavoidable, it came with a corresponding amount of uncertainty of what the man was doing whilst he was away. He might be hunting, of course, but he might also have bagged his prey really easily and quickly, and was spending the rest of the day sitting under a tree eating magic mushrooms or smoking some hallucinatory substance rather than catching more prey or rushing back to repair to the family hut. So he might be working very hard, or he might be using the time to sit on his arse. Who knows? Not her, that's for sure. And of course, he might well be doing something else. He might be doing what every woman fears. He might very well be doing someone else. And that, of course, is the most intolerable thing of all. And that can't be allowed. That cannot be allowed at all. So the beauty of surveillance is that, to those with a particular axe to grind, like hardcore militant feminists for instance, it denies men the autonomy and independence that they have always enjoyed. If women can't have it, so the possibly unconscious thinking goes, why should men? There is arguably a point of principle here. There is if you think hard enough. In the late 70s, a climate of fear was developing in Yorkshire and the north of England due to the murderous activities of Peter Sutcliffe, otherwise known as the Yorkshire Ripper. Since the West Yorkshire police at the time were having no luck in finding Sutcliffe, a senior policeman suggested that all women in the region should not go out after dark. Now, to many, this seemed like eminently sensible advice. However, many women's groups seized on this idea as a de facto curfew on women. Since women were the victims and not the perpetrators, assuming the killer was not a woman, of course, it was unfair that it was women who were compelled to remain indoors. Why not, they reasoned, insist that all men remain at home after dark? Well, why not? Why not indeed? It's a good question. So why should men have these freedoms that women do not? Well, one of the reasons is that women, by and large, don't want them. Men seldom pass up the chance for sex, and in the days before DNA testing, there was no real reason to refuse sex. There was little chance of being discovered and almost none in proving paternity. It was her word against his. But for a woman, in the days before easily available contraception, it was utterly foolish for a woman to indulge in casual sex in the way that men did, since it may result in a life-changing, decades-long commitment. So guess what? women didn't do it. Now we have contraception, and a minority of women do behave this way, but they are pretty rare, and that's because thousands of years of biological conditioning doesn't get swept away in a generation or two. The idea of a woman's fertility being bound up with her morality is perhaps fundamentally unfair, but there it is. It is there, and it's pretty difficult to shift, which is why, given the surveillance technology that we have today, it is easier to make it fair by keeping men under constant observation, and thereby making it clear to them that their wanderings are being monitored for future possible judgment. It's easier to do that than to make things fair, and make things fair than to wait for a millennia for social mores to catch up. Because that's what's most important, isn't it? Fairness. We all have to be the same, no matter what the consequences. And that is the all-encompassing philosophy of surveillance generally. In matters of terrorism, it is a fact that in the last 20 years it is overwhelmingly perpetrated by those of an Islamic bent. Therefore, it would seem sensible, proportionate even, to target those communities. But in our so-called multicultural society, that would seem somehow unfair. But would it? My feeling, and it is only a feeling, is that those in the Muslim communities up and down the country who are desperately trying to root out those in their midst who have such murderous intentions would welcome such monitoring, so long as it is not forever, and of course we need always to guard against that. The security services might be better able to cope with the quite frankly narrow threat that we face. But oh no, that would be unfair, it would be discriminatory, and it might even be, horror of horrors, racist. So, much better to put the entire population under constant surveillance, because at least we can say that it's fair, no matter that it makes it 10 times harder to find terrorists before they strike. So surveillance can be used by the supposedly oppressed, in this case women, to remove the freedoms enjoyed by the oppressor, men, that the oppressed have no use for. Men, if they are honest with themselves, naturally desire and practice mobility, autonomy, independence, and yes, freedom. Women, on the other hand, tend towards a nesting instinct, community, interdependence, and much less in the way of the loner. Once again, there are exceptions, but broadly this is the case. Women are not interested in freedom, since they have little use for it. Consequently, they find it difficult to understand why men need it, other than as an excuse for concealing what they would rather women didn't know. And since this is why they believe men value freedom more than women, it is precisely why they wish to deny it to men. Is this paranoia? I don't believe it is. George Orwell had a word for it in 1984. He called it own life. Own life was the suspect behaviour that his hero Winston Smith indulged in. It amounted to no more than going for a walk. But in a society like Orwell's 1984, and increasing like ours, this freewheeling anonymity is viewed with suspicion. Where are you going? Why are you just wandering around? Are you loitering with intent? Are you scoping out houses to burgle? Are you scouting around for vulnerable women to stalk, assault, rape and murder? Why aren't you sitting at home where we can keep an eye on you? Why are you being so secretive? What are you hiding? However, luckily for the power hungry and for the control freaks in our society, these are questions that don't need to be asked. Because the wheres and the whens and the hows, courtesy of CCTV, are already known. And the whys, well, the whys can be surmised. The whys can be assumed, and they can be interpreted into whatever the watcher wants them to be or to look like. So that the very act of going for a walk or a drive for no particular reason will mark you out as someone who is exhibiting unusual behaviour. And over time, unusual will become suspicious. Suspicion will turn into subversion. Subversion will transmute into sedition, and sedition will eventually equate with criminal. In this way, freedom is snuffed out. As our society becomes ever more feminised, with women's perspectives in the ascendancy, this smothering of natural independence, autonomy and freedom will likely not be noticed by women, nor by the institutions whose philosophies they have infiltrated. The danger for women as well as for men is that these liberties will have been snuffed out before we realise their real and crucial value. So, those are my suspicions. In short, I believe that women, consciously or not, are seeking to put men on the surveillance leash. I welcome your comments, as I will be delighted to be proved wrong. However, I don't believe I am. If you agree with anything I've said and you'd like to help me out, then please subscribe. Thank you.